dig into critical race theory. The reason why is because critical race theory, like radical Marxist feminism, has been very much a part of the mental health system and the way the mental health system oppresses heterosexual white men, and has done so more or less since the 1960s and 70s. After the liberal faction took dominance over the conservative faction. As I've noted, it's not really, the thing is with psychiatry, it's not so much about politics as it is about psychiatry controlling people. Because regardless of what the politics are, it could be the politics of Nazi Germany, the politics of the USSR, the politics of McCarthyite America, or the politics of communism, of U.S. limp-wristed communism, like this new nonsense communism that makes no sense. It doesn't matter what it is, regardless of what the prevailing social idea is, whatever the prevailing ideas of academia are, mental health becomes that which acts as the vehicle to change society in concordance with that for the benefit of psychiatry. Not for the benefit of society, for the benefit of psychiatry. Okay? And that's what you need to understand. It's not for your benefit, it's not for my benefit, it's not for society's benefit, it's for the benefit of psychiatry. Now, before I start this video, I want to remind people I'm not a physician. I'm not a DO, I'm not an MD, I'm not an ND. I'm not a chiropractor. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not an acupuncturist. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a CNA. I'm not an LPN. I'm not an RN. I'm not a nurse practitioner. So I'm going to skip down to these tenets here. So scholars of critical race theory say that race is not biologically grounded and natural, although, if you remember from my videos on Franz Boas, I pointed out and proved that yes, race is biological. Rather, it is a socially constructed category used to oppress and exploit people of color. Now, if race was not biological, how could there be people of color? Just saying. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. According to CRT, negative stereotypes assigned to members of minority groups benefit white people. Okay, whatever. So, an American lawyer / professor, Derek Albert Bell Jr., and civil rights activist, writes that racial equality is impossible and illusory. I don't think that's true. I think we came very close to racial equality before the Obama administration. I think that the pushing of this critical race theory into the political spectrum and into the social spectrum by Obama at first, and then very hard by Trump with his platinum plan, things of that nature, I think that's really what did away with it. I mean, the problem is, you're not going to have racial equality in the sense that not everybody is equal, but you're not going to have individual equality either. People have different aptitudes. People have different abilities, okay? Different people are different. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be equal before the law, but you will see critical race theory doesn't like that people are equal before the law. The concept of standpoint theory became particularly relevant to critical race theory when it expanded to include a black feminist standpoint by Patricia Hill Collins. Now, you'll notice that feminism, the race issue, and the LGBTQIAP+ movement, they all kind of go together. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, tenets of CRT have spread beyond academia and are used to deepen understanding of socio-economic issues such as poverty, police brutality, and voting rights violations. Now, the thing is, voting rights violations include asking people for their identification to vote. Mexico, which, by the way, Mexico is more or less mestizo, but it's multi-ethnic. There are different ethnic groups in Mexico. Okay, now they have a mandatory federal ID law, okay? And you have to show your ID when you vote. When I go to vote, there has not been a single time that I've gone to vote since I've been 18. I don't go every election, but there has not been a single time that I've gone to vote that I have not been asked for my identification. Also, the majority of the people that are, the majority of the people in my area that are African American or Latino or Asian or Middle Eastern or East Indian, etc., are on public assistance, okay? Now, in order to get public assistance, you are required to show identification, okay? Now, what you will notice, you will never notice East Indians complaining about voters' rights violations. It's rare that you'll see Middle Eastern Americans complaining about voters' rights violations. Because there aren't really any voters' rights violations taking place. At least not in my area that I'm aware of. It's never been an issue. Although people do complain about it a lot, it's never been a proven issue. Richard Delgado and CRT, structural determinism, race essentialism, critique of liberalism. This is where you gotta understand this. They don't like liberals. You liberals need to understand this. These critical race theorists, they're not that into you. Why are they not that into you? Because they don't believe affirmative action and colorblindness are good for them. They claim that the liberal concept of value-neutral law, meaning law based on the law, meaning that law should be applied equally to all people, that the punishment should fit the crime, doesn't work. An example, questioning foundational liberal conceptions of Enlightenment values such as rationalism. Of course, rationalism is awful, apparently. Progress. Renard Strickland's 1986 Kansas Law Review article, Genocide at Law, and a Historical and Contemporary View of a Native American Experience, yada, 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 into the law, da, da. Now, this is what you have to understand. These laws, racist laws, are the exception, not the norm, okay? If a law is racist, the law itself is violating the concept of equality or colorblindness or other things like that. So you can't say that these things don't work or equitable laws don't work. Bad laws don't work. When the laws violate these rules, the laws don't work. Okay? So when it says Native Americans were in most cases carried, like this was done unscrupulously, but it was done scrupulously and with legality, that might be true that it was legal, but the law was not a good law, and that's why a lot of those laws have been overturned since. Okay, so David Theo Goldberg described how countries that adopt classical liberalism's concepts of individualism, equality, and freedom. So when we adopt individualism, meaning the individual matters, and liberty matters, equality matters, and freedom, such as the United States and European countries, somehow this is concealing structural racism. Okay? How? I have no idea, but that's according to them. So, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw traced the origins of the New Right's use of the concept colorblindness from the 1970s neoconservative think tanks to the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Now, Reagan was certainly not a conservative. I even pointed out how he was for amnesty for illegal migrants. He was also a card-carrying commie. So, in the 1960s, Reagan was a communist. He was also a liberal Democrat. Okay? She described how prominent figures such as neoconservative scholars, Thomas Sowell. Now, Thomas Sowell, you can actually find a video of him on YouTube talking about how IQ tests are lower among certain groups of people because of a lack of education. Now, anybody that knows anything about IQ tests knows that that's impossible. Okay, IQ doesn't measure education, it measures intelligence. We know that. Thomas Sowell is using an old communist dictum while he claims to be anti-communist to justify why certain people are underachieving in some areas. But this is the funny thing. How come white people aren't as athletic as some other groups of people? How come Asian people aren't as athletic as some other groups of people? Is it because of cultural bias, or is it because they just aren't that great at certain things compared to other groups of people? Now, that's the question I have. Why are there not excuses made for white Americans and Asian Americans? Why is there not a huge push to racially integrate the NBA or the NFL or the NHL or NASCAR? Well, there probably have been movements to try and racially integrate the NHL and NASCAR. But how come the NBA and the NFL have not been racially integrated? And how come there's more Caucasian women in the WNBA than there are white men in the NBA? How come these questions aren't being asked? Is it because of bias? Or is it because some people are good at some things and some people aren't good at some things? And maybe culture is unique to those individuals, as critical race theory recognizes that culture is... now, they claim that race is not biological, but yet they also claim that you have to be authentically this or authentically that. Well, culture, which favors certain things and certain groups of people, you'll remember I talked about sexual selection. Well, there's also what Kevin MacDonald calls the culture of critique, and every culture has a culture of critique. It just so happens different cultures critique differently, such as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant work ethic, as how the white Anglo-Saxon culture, the white Anglo-Saxon American culture was critiqued, was through work ethic, not being lazy, hard work, and roll up your sleeves. And the African American culture, toughness and being good at things like basketball is favored. I'm not making that up. You can go to school with black folks and you can see that. I did go to school with black folks. I grew up around black folks. Okay? I understand what they value. Being able to spit rhymes on the school bus is considered something to be respected. Okay? What they don't respect is doing well in academia. Okay? So you could even say that there is a culture of critique going on in every culture, but where does that culture of critique come from? Well, it comes from the people that make up that culture, doesn't it? So sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva describes this newer, subtle form of racism as colorblind racism, right, which uses frameworks of abstract liberalism to decontextualize race, naturalize outcomes such as segregation in neighborhoods. This is the thing. People do tend to self-segregate. It's just the truth. And actually what's funny is people are segregated by income, not necessarily by race. So storytelling and counter-storytelling. If you have storytelling is part of your expression, you're probably full of shit. I'm just saying. You shouldn't have to refer to something as storytelling or counter-storytelling. But following the Civil War, the African-American woman was depicted as a wise, caregiving, quote, mammy figure. During Reconstruction period, African-American men were stereotyped as brutish and bestial, a danger to white women and children. This was exemplified in Thomas Dixon Jr.'s novels. Now, what's interesting about that is you can look at the crime statistics and make up your own mind. Okay? The epic film The Birth of a Nation which celebrated a certain group of folks. During the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans were depicted as musically talented and entertaining. Following World War II, when many black veterans joined the civil rights movement, African Americans were portrayed as cocky and street smart. The unreasonable opportunist militant, the safe, comforting, cardigan-wearing TV sitcom character, and the super stud blaxploitation films. Now, what they're saying is they don't like the very things that are marketed toward them. These things would not have made it as big as they did if they weren't marketed towards that segment of the population who enjoys that. Okay? They see themselves, these people, as role models. Okay? The empathetic fallacy informs the time warp aspect of racism, where the dominant culture can see racism only through the hindsight of a past era or distant land, such as South Africa. Through centuries of stereotyping, that's not true at all. If anybody remembers, during apartheid, people made erroneous comparisons to apartheid South Africa and slavery, when that was not the case in South Africa. Okay? Since the system of free expression tends to favor the interest of powerful elites and to assign responsibility for racist stereotypes to marketplace of ideas, in decades, well, it is the marketplace of ideas. Look at rap music. Where do you think rap music comes from? Do you think it fell from the sky? Come on. Since racism makes people feel uncomfortable, the empathetic fallacy helps the dominant culture mistakenly believe it no longer exists. Nobody has ever said racism doesn't exist. In fact, racism is touted again and again and again and again as the most prevailing horrible thing. I can't remember a time in my life, from preschool through now, that racism hasn't been considered the number one threat to this country. I have a hard time seeing it, except against white people. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that, it's not, it might not be as prominent as some people think it is. Standpoint of epidemiology. This is the view that members of racial minority groups have a unique authority and ability to speak about racism. This is seen as undermining dominant narratives relating to racial inequality, such as legal neutrality and personal responsibility, or bootstrapping through valuable first-hand accounts of the experience of racism. Revisionist interpretations of American civil rights and progress. Interest convergence in the concept introduced by Derek Bell, Harvard Law Review, blah, 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 anti-desegregation law, yada, 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 Moore's Ford lynchings, yada, 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 intersectional theory. Now, this is how you get this craziness with the gay rights and the women's rights and the all sorts of rights. This refers to the examination of race, sex, class, national origin, and sexual orientation, and how their intersections play out in various settings, such as how the needs of a Latina are different from those of a black male. Well, no shit. The needs of a Latina are also different from that of another Latina. But I don't see I don't see the point there. Individuals have individual needs. Essentialism versus anti-essentialism. Delgado and Stefancic write, scholars who write about these issues are concerned with the appropriate unit of analysis. Is the black community one or many communities? Do middle and working class African Americans have different interests and needs? Do all oppressed peoples have something in common? This is what I find funny. Are middle class African Americans oppressed? I don't think so. I've worked with middle class I've worked with upper middle class black Americans. They've been my supervisors. I don't think they're very oppressed, and I do think they use their positions to oppress everyone under them, particularly whites, and to give priority to promoting people below them that happen to be of the same race as them. From an essentialist perspective, now imagine if whites did that. From an essentialist perspective, one's identity consists of an internal essence that is static and unchanging from birth, whereas a non-essentialist position holds that the subject has no fixed permanent identity. Racial essentialism diverges into biological and cultural essentialism, where subordinated groups may endorse one over the other. Cultural and biological forms of racial essentialism share the idea that differences between racial groups are determined by a fixed and uniform essence that resides within and defines all members of each racial group. However, they differ in their understanding of the nature, blah, blah, blah. This is just a bunch of mental masturbation. It's not even that interesting. It's pretty boring. Structural determinism and race, sex, class, blah, 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 cultural nationalism. And this is what you have to understand. There's cultural nationalism and separatism. This refers to the exploration of more radical views that argue for separation and reparations as a form of foreign aid, including black nationalism. Okay, and I'm going to show you what happens when the same idea is applied to white people who are being racially, there's institutionalized and legal racism against white people, which is exactly what affirmative action is. It's the legal racism through quota systems against white heterosexual men in hiring, education, and promotion. Legal institutions, critical pedagogy, and minorities in the bar, blah, 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 black, white, binary. Now, this is what's funny. I don't know of anybody that sees the world in a black, white, binary except for African Americans. See, where I grew up, and this is what's funny, where I grew up, people would say where I grew up was a white area. Where I grew up was not a white area. Where I grew up, now it's 80% black, but at the time, I mean, it was majority white, but what's interesting, not really, because mestizos are considered white, and there were a lot of mestizos. There were a lot of blacks, okay, a considerable and a high amount of blacks in my schools, especially the schools I went to, because I got kicked out of the regular public school, which already had a decent amount of blacks. But my point is where I grew up, even though it was majority white, it was multiracial, okay? It was not racially singular. There were multiple races living there. Applications and adaptions, yada, 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 moving on. Now, this is very important. This is establishing the Marxist roots of critical race theory and detail the threat of this divisive ideology to the American Republic. Now, this needs to be understood. This is House Resolution 1303, establishing the Marxist roots of critical race theory and detail the threat this divisive ideology poses to the American Republic. Establishing them, blah, 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 blah. This is the people that are behind it. Okay, resolution establishing the Marxist roots. Whereas critical race theory identifies a special kind of property whiteness created by white people originally from Europe in order to grant themselves power and privilege while excluding other racial groups from whiteness and its punitive benefits, whereas critical race theory teaches children that they are either oppressors or oppressed based solely on the color of their skin. Again, how can you deny a biological basis of race, yet state that you can be oppressed based on your biology? Whereas critical race theory accordingly claims to identify a racial stratification. Again, if there's no biology in race, How can there be a racial stratification of American society and its institutions created by access to and exclusion from whiteness as a specialized form of racial property that confers social capital upon those with access to it, whereas critical race theory designates as privileged those granted access to whiteness, contends that this white privileged status is maintained by an ideological commitment to what it calls white supremacy, in quotations, by which it means maintenance of this form of racial property, in quotations, and the capacity to exclude certain people from it, and thus establishes therein a, quote, racial hierarchy within the United States. Whereas critical race theory frames the alleged racial class stratification of American society as racial class antagonism across this line of stratification, whereas critical race theory explicitly frames this racial class antagonism as structural in nature under the term structural racism and systemic racism, sees it as structurally determinate upon the character of the United States citizens, and defines it in terms of a structural dialectic analogous to Karl Marx's doctrine of structural classism, material determinism, and dialectical materialism. Whereas critical race theory claims that structural racism is the fundamental organizing principle of the United States society. How they get that, I have no clue, and its ordinary state of affairs, thus framing the United States as an intrinsically unjust, oppressive, and racist nation, and this being in direct analogy to Karl Marx's views on the structural nature of capitalism, which was his character. Now, what you have to understand, cultural Marxism, because they realized that in the West, people did fairly well because we didn't have the strong class stratification of Europe, okay, or China for that matter. So a lot of people had the ability to rise up economically in the West. Ironically, prior to the vast liberalization of society and essentially the merger of capitalism with liberalism. Okay, so prior to capitalists calling themselves communists, which is actually what BLM has done, because nobody's a better capitalist than they are, making money off of people by selling the idea of communism. That's what I like to say about Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has gotten very, 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 very wealthy selling the promise of communism to idiots. And that's kind of what critical race theory is doing, is it's selling the promise of communism, but instead of using capitalism as the scapegoat, it's using structural racism. Now, people know I'm ardently anti-capitalist. I'm anti-capitalist because capitalism breeds corruption. Okay, we know that. People that follow my channel know that. However, what you need to understand is the idea, I'm not pro-Marxist because Marxism doesn't work, as Benito Mussolini pointed out, and this is the problem with this kind of racism, this racist doctrine, okay? Like Benito Mussolini pointed out, the primary problem with communism is how do you make a society function when every class in that society wants to kill each other? Because that's what communism does. Communism turns the working class against the middle class against the working class and the rich, and the middle class is the working class, let's be honest, and it turns the rich, well, it gets rid of the rich. It turns the rich into the poor. Or it gets rid of them for real, you know. Critical race theory contends that its purpose is to awaken a racial class consciousness, pursuant to its own defining words, calling into question the very foundations of the liberal order. So it's calling into foundations things like justice, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Because the last thing apparently we need, according to critical race theory, is for the law to be applied equally to equal people. Everybody knows that if a white person commits a crime, they should get the same punishment as a black person. If a Chinese person commits the same crime as a black person, they should get the same punishment as a black person would. If you know what I'm saying? So, what the idea behind constitutional law and having the law obey the law is that the law is applied based on, like, the punishment fits the crime, not the race of the person. And critical race theory is saying, no, there have to be special rules for special people. And that's against reason. That's against justice. That's against any sense of fairness. Okay, whereas critical race theorists consider themselves highly suspicious of rights and thus set themselves in opposition to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the American founding ideals of inalienable rights secured by the government, and social fabric of the American Republic. And they do. People might say they don't, but they do. Whereas critical race theory, in its own words, contains an activist dimension such that it not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better, and thereby affirms the dialectical conception of the world and man's role in it put forth by Karl Marx. Okay? So, it wants to, and that's right, it wants to establish a dictatorship of anti-racists, and you guys can read this on your own. So, resolved that House representatives recognize critical race theory and its derivatives as a form of Marxist ideology. 2, recognizes that critical race theory exists in direct opposition to the founding ideals, way of life, and form of government of the United States. That must be understood. Critical race theory is no less than a declaration of war against this republic, and people need to understand that. It declares that the Marxist ideology, critical race theory, the Marxist ideology, critical race theory, poses a significant threat to the United States Republic, its citizens, and the free people of the world. No crap. If anybody saw what happened with BLM, it went all the way around the world. It destabilized Britain. It destabilized Japan. It did a lot of bad all around the world. Moving on. Now, I'm not a fan of the Heritage Foundation, because I think it's a baloney-ass, neocon bullshit organization. But I do think people should read this article, A Critical Look at Critical Race Theory in America's Classrooms, because essentially, American children are being indoctrinated with hatred. When we come back, I'm going to delve into Afrocentrism, Eurocentrism, Sinocentrism. I'm going to explain the similarities, the differences, etc. And I'm going to eventually show how these play into the what appears to be a planned genocide by the mental health industry against various populations, but most importantly, the heterosexual white male population of the United States of America, most importantly, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Whether they know it or not, they might not even know it's planned, but it's one of those things that's an inconvenient thing that has happened by the idiocy of the people behind these ideas. And that's all for this video. I'll be moving on tomorrow.